Welcome to episode 17 of More Than Just Maps. I'm your host, Ollie Powers. This podcast was created with the intent to help anyone in the GIS field get from where they are now to where they want to be that your first job, a career move, or just improving your GIS game overall. On this week's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Lieutenant Ronald Vaughn of Dallas Fire Rescue. When his dreams of becoming a police officer turned into becoming a firefighter and paramedic instead, Lieutenant Vaughn never dreamed of the day when he would be voluntold into the world of GIS. After almost 20 years in the field, Lieutenant Vaughn was given the assignment to find out what this GIS thing was for the department, and he hasn't looked back. And now for part one of my interview with Lieutenant Ronald Vaughn. I'm here today with Lieutenant Ronald Vaughn of the City of Dallas Fire Department. Welcome, Ron.
How you doing? Great to be here.
I'm doing good. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here. So let's get started. So let's start with your background. So you didn't get into GIS in the traditional manner of you kind of found it in school, or I don't even know if there is a traditional manner of getting into GIS, but you are a firefighter first and foremost, correct?
That is correct. I've been a firefighter. Excuse me. I've been a firefighter and paramedic with the Dallas Fire Rescue for about going on 26 years now.
That's a long time. So did you always want to be a firefighter when you were a kid, or that just happen? How did you get into that profession, first of all?
Actually, I wanted to be a police officer.
Really?
Yes. When I was in college, I was playing college basketball. When it got toward the end of my playing days, I wasn't good enough to go pro. I had to think about it. What is it that I want to do for the rest of my life? And so I had thought about being a police officer, but I wasn't 100% sure or all in on it, because during that time in Dallas, a lot of police officers were actually getting killed here in Dallas. And I didn't know if that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and I can see that being a drawback.
Yeah, it was. And so I started working in the jail. I started working at Dallas County Jail just to see if law enforcement would be something that I wanted to do. And then I had a couple of people that worked there with me ask me how I thought about being a firefighter. And at that time, at the age I was at that time, I didn't think being a firefighter was cool. I thought it was cool to drive around in fast cars and carry a gun. But I went head on and took the test, and when I got on the department, I was real happy. I hadn't looked back since. It's been very rewarding for me. I've been able to do a lot of things, meet a lot of interesting people. So I really enjoy what I'm doing.
So, and there's a lot of physical requirements to be a firefighter as well. So you have to do like an aptitude test, I guess, and then... Yeah,
I had to pass a physical fitness. Actually, I had to pass three tests. One was a physical fitness test. And then once I passed that, I'm sorry, let me back up a minute. The first test I took was a civil service test. And whatever my score was on that civil service test, that allowed me to go to the next test, which was a math and science test.
Okay.
And that test basically was to see how well I would do if I got hired, how well I would do in paramedic school.
Okay.
So at the time I took those two tests, I had no idea that I had to be a paramedic also. I just thought you were just a firefighter and that was it.
Okay.
And so once I passed those two tests, then I went to the physical fitness test. And once I passed physical fitness test, then that's when I started going through the actual process. And then when I went through the interview process, at that time, the interview process was 4 hours long. And what I didn't realize is when I was taking the civil service test, a portion of the test was a psychological test also. And so I noticed that when I was going through my 4-hour interview at that time, they were asking me a lot of the same questions, but they were wording them different. And I guess they were trying to see if I was going to, make anything up or I wasn't being truthful or honest. But back then, it was pretty rigorous to get on. I don't know the process now, but then it was very rigorous. And so when I got into the academy, the first day they told us for every one of you that hired, we had to turn down 100. And so I kind of felt privileged at that point that, man, maybe I am part of something here. And what I didn't realize also when I was going through my interview, they said, well, you're going to have to ride the ambulance. I said, okay. I didn't know what I was saying okay to. I just said okay. But I didn't know I was going to be riding for 15 years. So
how does that work? Being from Toronto, we have paramedics and firefighters. They're not really joint. But in Texas, a lot of cities, they're joint. So how does that work? Like half the time you're on firefighter duty and half the time you're on paramedic duty?
That's a good question, and you pretty much answered. So the traditional firefighter shift is 24 hours on, 48 hours off. Okay. So when you look at it, you work about 10 days out of the month. Now, if you have a vacation or a holiday in there, then you may work 9 or 8 days. But to keep it simple, you work 10 days out of the month. So the rule is, the rule that is written in our manual procedures is that you have to do 50% firefighting duty, 50% duty on the ambulance as a paramedic. Even though that when you're on the engine, you're still a paramedic, but you have to ride that frontline ambulance 50% of the time. Now, it seems like a good concept, but in reality, it doesn't work that way. You end up doing maybe 60-40, 70-30 on the ambulance, because that's pretty much where you make most of your calls at, being a paramedic. About 80% of the calls that we make in Dallas are EMS related. So even though you are a firefighter and you got to keep up your firefighter certification, you're still a paramedic first and foremost.
So I imagine being a firefighter is tough enough. You're pulling people out of dangers. You're getting into sometimes very serious situations. And that's one mindset that you have to have. But now you're also being a paramedic at the same time. So that's a little different probably than what you thought you were getting into, right?
It is, because actually, to be honest with you, I really didn't know what I was getting into. I was just wanting to do something different. And so when I told him, I don't mind, I'll do whatever you want me to do. But what I didn't realize is that the majority of my job was going to be on the ambulance. And it really gets hard. It really gets difficult. I know I got a lot to say, and I'm trying not to say as much as I want to say. But it is. Being on the ambulance, a lot physical and a lot of mental challenges that go involved, because you see people, and the same way when you're on the fire engine, you see things, you see people at their worst. And so that's the hardest part of it. It's easy to see people when they're good, but you always see people at their worst. And after a period of time, there are certain calls that can get to you, and there's still calls that still affect me even to today. And I try not to think about them as much. But it is a very physical and emotional job.
And so how long were you out there doing the calls? Was that, how many years was that?
Okay, so like I said earlier, for 15 years, well, I'm still a paramedic. Okay. I don't ride anymore. I hadn't ridden an ambulance in about 6 years.
Okay.
But I was in the field for about 20 years. I did 15 years on the ambulance, and then after I got off the ambulance, I was assigned to driving a fire engine.
Okay, so you became a driver after that.
Right, and oh man, that was really cool. Just driving a fire engine from A to B.
I imagine that is quite the navigation. Those trucks are massive.
That was cool. That was cool. The hardest part about being a driver, which wasn't hard for me, is you have to really know your district. So wherever you're assigned, you have to know your district without even looking it up. And
okay, so that's actually a really good question here. I remember when I was in school, I actually have a second cousin who's a firefighter. And I was talking to him about how they were getting to different calls. And he's like, oh, yeah, we've got this map book. And they're still looking it up on paper. So was the city of Dallas, were they still doing everything on paper, or
actually, have they moved to digital? That is a really good question. Oh, man, that's a good question, because that's tying into some of the stuff that we're working on. Okay, there are several ways you get to your call. Okay, for example, you get a call that says you got a breathing difficulty at 121 Main Street, Cross Street, Olive. Okay, so that's your cross streets you look for. So if a person is not familiar with that particular area, there's several ways you can look it up. One way is you can ask, and then they give you the map score coordinates.
Okay.
So I'm pretty sure if anybody out there is familiar with a map score, it's just a book that tell you, okay, map score 25G, for example. So you go to page 25, and then you go to the box that says G, and boom, you find the street, and then you figure out how to get to that area. That's one way to do it. Another way we do it is stations will go and they'll blow up, go get a big blow up of their map scope pages that they're going to make calls to. That way they don't have to go sift through the book.
Okay.
Another way that is done by a lot of older firefighters long before me is they have what's called a route book. And I think that's maybe something that your second cousin is talking about, where somebody has actually took every street in their district and have wrote down the directions to every street in their district. I have one here that I use that I show every now and then. It's a route book. And somebody actually sat down, either wrote or typed out. And the one I have, they use the old MS-DOS typing. That's how old this book is.
So there's no maps and there's no images. It's all words of how to get from the fire station to every single spot in the district.
Right. Exactly. It'll say right on St. Augustine, left on Brewton, right on Old Mill Lane, left. That's how you get there. You just follow that. You follow that.
So it's like really similar to like the taxi driver guides that they used to have. They used to have like these written guides for taxi drivers of how to get from any street to any street.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the exact same way. And so now what some of the station officers are doing now, since we have a lot of brand new drivers, we don't have any what we like to call old head or old school drivers. They'll call me and they say, hey Lou, can you give me a map of our district? And I'll give them two maps. I'll give them one that has a map of their district with the street names on them, and then I'll give them a blank one. And this is actually how I had to take driver's tests as I was coming up through the ranks. Every station I went to, my officer would give us a blank map of a particular area, and you had to write the street names in on them.
So you had to memorize the whole area.
Right. And so they're doing that now. And because what's happening, we had a period of time there where everybody was relying on GPS. But there's so many things that are going on in Dallas in terms of streets being closed down, streets being cut through, streets that was once there are no longer there, or a street may be closed down for a period of time while work is getting done to it. And so even though if you follow that GPS telling you, hey, turn right on this street, turn left up here, even though you have that, what was happening, our response times were getting delayed because of that. And so a lot of the officers have took it upon themselves to go back to the way it was that, okay, as a driver, you have to know your district. So if a street is cut off, closed down, no longer there, you're going to have to figure out a way to get there now.
So they're still using just their own mental maps of the areas.
That's probably the best way to do it. Because like I said, for 15 years on an ambulance, I had to actually learn not only my district that we would consider our first due or first up district. I had to learn the districts that if another ambulance was out, we were the second or the third ambulance to cover that area. So I had to learn a wider area as a paramedic than I did as a driver on the engine.
So, and how many districts does Dallas have? It's a pretty big city.
We have 9 districts.
Okay.
And each district have anywhere from 5 to 6 stations per district.
So you're learning about a third to half of the city at any given point, depending on where you're stationed, right?
Exactly. So we have 58 fire stations in Dallas. We're building a 59th.
Oh my gosh.
Station right now. So we're gonna have. So by the end of by this time next year, we'll have 59 stations up and running, and we're actually looking at building a 60th station now.
That's a lot of memorization.
It is.
Yeah. So about when were they starting? Are you guys still using GPS? I know there's a lot of different routing softwares for emergency response. Are you guys still using that, or are you still?
Yeah, we're still using. We're still using it. We're still using the GPS. It's on the actual on our mobile data computers.
Okay.
It's just a button that you press, and it'll have a map, and then also the locution is what we call it. She'll talk, and so one of the problems I saw with that when I was out there, even when I was driving the engine, you have to go a certain speed to be able to keep up with what she's saying. Okay. If you go faster than the speed that is set at, which is if you're in an emergency situation, we can go 15 miles over the speed limit. Okay. So if you're going 15 miles over the speed limit, it's going to be difficult for her to keep up with where you're going.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
That makes sense to me. I hope that makes sense to everybody else.
And so if you have, and now we got some people that are, I like to call them speed demons that drive a little bit more than 15 miles over. Then the system never catches them. So you have to kind of stay as close to 15 miles per hour over the speed limit to try to get her to have some chance of keeping up with you.
That kind of reminds me a little bit of navigational rallies. I used to do that before I moved to Texas. That was a lot of fun. But with those, you have to be on time. It's not the first person to show up at a checkpoint. It's you have to be on time, and you never know if you're on time or not. So it's kind of similar to that. So the best, but for me, the best way is for you to just learn your district. And one of the knocks, when I first made lieutenant, they sent me to a station to work, and I had a young man driving me. I'm not going to call his name. And so we get in the engine. We were going to a automatic fire alarm at this building. And so when I first made lieutenant, they moved me around for about 3 months before I actually got assigned to a station. And so I go to this station. I'm not going to get a part of town, but we go to automatic fire alarm in this building. So I get in the engine, and I say, hey, man, let's go. And he's sitting there. And I'm like, hey, let's go. And he said, I don't know where to go. I said, well, look in the maps, go. And he told me he didn't know how to read one. Oh, my gosh.
And I said, well, look at the map. Don't you got a route book on a map? No, sir. He said normally, whenever I drive, whoever the lieutenant is, whoever the officer is that day, they just press that button over there and they tell me which way to go. So and I said, I can't press this button because technology. Right. And I said, man, I can't press this button because I need to read what information is in this building that we're going to.
Yeah.
Because if I press this button and and the map comes up how to get you from point A to point B, I'm not going to be able to read what's in this building.
Yeah.
So I said, well, just take off driving and I'll read it up in the maps and I'll tell you.
Okay.
And so here I am trying to read a maps tell him which way to go, and read the comments on what's going on in this building. And so we get there, and it was nothing. It was really nothing. Mm-hmm. So we get back to the station, and I say, hey, if you want to continue to drive me the rest of this day, you're going to learn how to read a maps code. So I spent 2 hours teaching him how to read a maps code.
That's unfortunate that he doesn't know that, but also it just kind of like an eye-opener, just people not having that map literacy, I guess, anymore, where they used to have it and you could just go ahead and do it. And now I guess, and I'm guessing that was recently or more recently than
that was almost 6 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, just even having access to like Google Maps and smartphones and all the other different mapping applications has definitely impacted, I guess, your industry a lot, because you're having people now who can't just go do that anymore.
That's true. When I came on, I guess I'm giving my age again. When I came on, there was no Google Maps. There was no Apple Maps. There was none of that. MapQuest, none of those even existed.
Oh gosh, MapQuest, that's an old one.
And so you actually had to learn or actually know how to read a map, because if you know how to read a map, then your officer wouldn't let you drive.
So how did this guy get on?
Well, because it's no longer a requirement like it used to be.
Ah, okay.
And that's what I was saying at the beginning. I don't know what the process is now because so much has changed. But yeah, you had to actually pass a test to learn how to read a map when you were in the academy.
It would probably be a good thing to bring back, it sounds like.
And so, like you just said, with all of the mapping applications that are out there now, and the department is getting younger, and I understand that. And I'm not one of those kind of people that try to hold on to what it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I know things change. But one thing I was trying to impress to that young man that day was, yeah, the technology is good in most situations, but you had a situation where I was new to that area. I was just there for that day.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what was in that building, and there's information in that building that I needed to know about. So by the time we get there, nobody would get hurt.
Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to explain to him. You know, that's where he as a driver have to have some idea of where he or she is going, so that officer can actually go through his or her mental picture, look at notes and look at what's on our MDC to decide, you know, okay, is this a go or no go? What's in here that's bad? What's here not bad? There's information that's given that we need to know before we get there.
That's a really good point. So since this is a GIS podcast, so you're not just a firefighter anymore. You are also the GIS coordinator for the fire department. So how did you transition from your role as a lieutenant that was only doing fire and rescue to becoming the GIS coordinator?
Okay, that's a real good question. And I like to tell this story because it's kind of funny. When I got assigned to downtown, I was afraid of what happened in New York, what happened in downtown Dallas. And so we went out and we did a lot of training and pre-planning and going through as many buildings in and around downtown as possible. But what I didn't know is that somebody down in City Hall noticed that I was doing that. And so I was coming up on, actually I just finished my 6-month probation. And the way our policy is written, every officer has to do at least 1.5 years in an administrative or desk position. Since I was one of the last ones to make lieutenant on the list that I made it on, I was one of the first to have to go get into an administrative position. So I had been on 20 years, and so I had one of the chiefs come by my station. He was out there getting gas at the gas pump because the station I was at had the gas pump where everybody who worked in City Hall on the fire side would come get their gas. Mm-hmm. And so he asked me to come outside, and he said, well, hey, you know it's your turn to get an administrative position. And I said, yeah, I was kind of looking at that. Do I have any choices? He said, yeah, you got 3 choices. I said, 3? He said, yeah. He said, now here's the deal. If you volunteer, he said, you got 3 choices. If you volunteer, you get to pick which one you want to go to. If you do not volunteer to go into a staff position, we're going to put you where we want to put you, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Because you have some people that try to come up with different ways to get out of going into an administrative position.
Yeah.
And so they end up, I don't know how they do it. I didn't want to go through the hassle and the work of trying to get out of going somewhere when eventually you're going to go anyway.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, okay, I'll just take a choice. And I said, what are my choices? He said, well, your choice is you can go to the EMS office and order all of our EMS supplies and pay all our EMS bills. I was like, no, I don't want to do that. He said, you can go to the academy and train rookies. And I'm like, okay, that's what I want to do. So that's what I'm saying to myself. Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah.
And he said, your third choice is GIS. I'm like, GIS? I said, I don't know what that is. So I said, well, I want to go to the academy and train rookies. He said, no, you're going to GIS.
Sounds
and
like
I'm like, what?
Your choice there got a little shafted.
Yeah, and I said, GIS? I said, what is GIS? He said, I don't know, but when you get there, you tell me. And so I called that chief that night. I said, are you serious? Were you really joking with me? Or were you really? He said, no. I've already sent the paperwork in. When I left the station talking to you, the next transfer list, you're going to be in GIS. And I'm like, man, I don't have a clue of what GIS is. I don't even know what it means. Never heard of it. How you going to send me somewhere and I don't want to go? He said, well, here's the deal. You know, you from here in Dallas. You've been on the department a while. we need somebody that's going to really care about this position. And so the next day I get home, I called the lieutenant that was there before me. And I asked him, what did he do? And he told me to ask, we had another firefighter that was there. She was there when we first started GIS with the department. He said, well, I didn't do anything. Laura did all the work. I'm like, what were you supposed to do? He said, Laura did all the work. I'm like, okay, well, what did you do? You've been in that position 6 years. What did you do? He said, whatever Laura said we needed to do. So I went by the office and I talked to her, and she kind of gave me a rundown of what she was working on, and which was our trail system. That was mainly, she said, I do trails, and if anybody want a map, I give them a map. And I'm like, that's it? She said, that's all I do. I do the trails, and if anybody wants a map, I make them a map. And I'm like, that's all you do? That's all I do. I said, okay. And so I know this kind of ties into, I guess I'm kind of telling the story. So I was there, and then I had a new boss at the time, and he wanted to get off into doing pre-incident planning.
Okay.
And so we started doing that. And then we were already doing our hydrant stuff also. But then I went to my first SCAR conference down in Corpus.
So I'm going to back you up a little bit first.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to back up a little bit there first. So when you got in there, what was the first thing that you were doing? Did they teach you how to use the software? Were they having you go out and collect fire hydrant points? How did you get into that?
Okay, well, the first month, I just sat around and did nothing. Because nobody would talk to me. I was in the office with other GIS professionals, and nobody would talk to me. But then I found out later that they really thought that I was just there for my time and I was going to leave. And so after about a month, the city held a GIS class for 2 days. And that's when I learned how to do desktop there. Okay. And so when I got there and learned that, I'm like, okay, I need to do some more with this other than just wait on somebody to call us for a map. So I went over to our EMS office and I said, hey, because at that time I was on our special event team. I said, we did a special event about a month ago. And it was a small little marathon. But we didn't know the route. We didn't know anything. I said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to start doing maps for all of our special events. That way, if we have to respond, we know where we know where everything is. I said, I know the map that sometimes the event will give you a map, but you can't really read it. I said, I'm going to get us a map that's firefighter friendly, that's user friendly for us, for firefighters. And they said, okay. So that's how I got into doing special events.
Okay.
And so then I remember when I was working downtown, I went over to the AAC and did a walk around at AAC. So I went back over to the American Airlines Center and got some information about that. So we put that also in the software. I did the same thing for the convention center, and then we ended up doing one for the state fair. So that's kind of how I got involved in actually doing GIS, basically looking at my experience in the field and looking what could make our men and women job in the field a lot more easier and smoother.
And that would also just help with response in general.
Exactly.
They can get in and out quicker. They can help faster, which is the whole point of fire rescue. Exactly.
Which was kind of, and I'm not knocking the last lieutenant there. I was like, he'd been on, this guy was in the academy class before. He'd been on about 6 months longer than me. I'm like, he should have saw all this, but I still don't know to the day what he did for those 6 years. but when I got into it and kind of started looking around, I'm like, man, there's a lot of things that we can do with this, and we're not maximizing it.
Yeah. I'm a little shocked that you're the first one for Dallas to notice that. I also started in GIS, so to me it's obvious, but I guess to people who don't come from that GIS background, it wasn't obvious at all.
It wasn't. The first lieutenant, I'm the third lieutenant we've had. The first one, he was there 4 years.
Okay.
And he started doing pre-plans on a lot of the buildings downtown. That's what he started with, and then this other lieutenant took over, and he didn't do anything else. And I'm not talking bad about him or anything else. He just didn't do anything else. Mm-hmm. And so I took one of the first things I did with the pre-plan stuff. I went and looked at what the first lieutenant had did that was 6 years old, and some of it was older than that. And I started with those buildings and just updating the information, updating the records. Some of the buildings that he did, they changed owners or they no longer exist anymore. So we just had to go through and update and upgrade all of that. The software that we're using actually helped out because the police had actually started doing threat assessments on some buildings prior to the Super Bowl. And so the Super Bowl that was here in 2011.
Okay.
So I went and got some of that information and started upgrading and looking at that information. And that kind of gave me a blueprint of how we're going to set up our pre-planned system. So that was pretty much the biggest thing that we did when I first got into GIS was pre-plans and mapping for those special events and doing our hydrant information, just making sure that's more clean because it wasn't really clean. So we had to scrub some data, get it up to par, get it looking this way. That was another main project that I worked on when I got there. Actually, before I started doing the mapping for the events, was getting our hydrant information more cleaner and more better. And so we've gotten to that point now where it's operating a whole lot smoother.
I'm really happy to hear that you were able to go in there with no GIS background, but you did have your firefighting background, and you were able to merge the two to create the GIS product that you guys needed. That's really amazing. It's those kind of things that I love about this field, where you're able to get the right information to the hands of the people who need it the most.
Need it, that's right.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Join us again in a couple of weeks for part 2, where we talk about some of the apps and projects Lieutenant Vaughn has helped with, and how he got involved with the South Central ARC Users Group, SCOG.